I've always enjoyed a bit of adventure and solitude. In fact, it's one of the reasons I first moved out to the mountains. As far from crowded city life as I could be while still being able to retain the creature comforts of a decent internet connection and partially paved roads. But even before that, I could go out of my way to explore abandoned urban areas, finding a sense of wonder in the decaying beams and crumbled structures. People thought it was, sort of creepy at best and, dangerous at worst, but I prided myself on never getting more than the occasional cut or bruise. Now, when I first moved to White Ridge, I knew it was everything I could hope for. Peaks covered in thick green foliage stretched on uninterrupted for as far as I could see in almost every direction. And from what research I'd done, it seemed there was a lot of lesser-traveled paths that weaved through the forest. Some supposedly even led to some small cabin ruins and abandoned mills. It was like the place was built for me, and I'm starting to wonder if that wasn't the case. It was an early fall day when I first set out into the woods. I'd barely started unpacking my new home, but there was a crispness to the air that morning that stirred something inside me, and I just had to explore my new surroundings before it morphed into the impassable freeze of winter. I dressed in a few warm layers, threw a day bag of water, granola bars, and some first aid basics over my shoulder, and set out as the rising sun tried its best to shine through the thick layer of clouds. As overcast as the day was, the forest appeared much darker than normal. Evergreens and oaks rose and settled thickly amongst each other, snuffing out the meager gray light offered by the sky above. It made for an eerie contrast with the seasonal changing leaves of the trees. The flashes of red and orange seemed harsher and more foreboding against their washed-out surroundings. I set out without a local map or destination in mind, which I know many will criticize from the get-go, but I did carry a compass as well as some pieces of fabric to use as tree markers as I went along. I'd never gotten lost before, and my hubris showed in my lack of foresight. Things started getting weird about 20 minutes into the hike. The brush and branches surrounding me had been alive with the lively sounds of birds and squirrel chatter, but the farther along the narrow dirt path I trekked, the more the sounds began to change. It was not an unsettling silence, but rather that the sounds were just wrong. What had begun as a cacophony of woodland animals and the rustling of leaves was morphing into something more akin to a busy coffee shop. Voices. There were voices rising to drown out the chirps and songs of nature. It sounded like a room filled with 50 or more animatedly murmuring individuals. It was as if I had stepped out of the forest and into an auditorium, despite my feet being firmly planted in the dirt. I spun around rapidly, trying to figure out where the voices were coming from. Most of them were too rushed and hurried to pick out any actual words, but they all sounded fairly urgent, even concerned. My mind raced as I tried to find a rational explanation. Was someone playing a prank using cleverly hidden speakers? Or was I having some sort of aneurysm? I felt fine, and I couldn't think of any reason someone would hide speakers a mile into a thickly wooded area. But curiosity won out on my better judgment, and I continued forward. Wind began to whip up around me, causing a whirlwind of autumn leaves to dance their way to the forest floor. The voices seemed oddly in sync with this, rising in volume, and I began to be able to pick out some phrases here and there, though none of them were overly comforting. "Wish I would have turned back here," the disembodied sound of a young woman lamented. "It's the leaves. They turn you around," another chimed in. this one sounding like an older man. A few I couldn't make out as they sounded entirely foreign to my ears, almost like some of the native dialects I could recall overhearing throughout my life. Some felt more ancient in a way that is difficult to describe. Too late to leave now. The time has passed. Yet another unidentifiable speaker. And then the voices all rose in unison, arguing and calling out to one another until I could feel my ears aching from the sheer volume. At that point, I began to stumble forward, half jogging but too disoriented to break out into a run. My brain was screaming for me to undertake. Colorful leaves of all shapes and sizes swirled dizzying around me, striking against me with vicious speed. And just as I thought it was getting to be too much, that surely the building pressure in my ears would burst my eardrums, everything fell quiet. Not completely silent. The voices still murmured in feverish disgruntlement, but they were scarcely above a whisper now. The wind died back down, the remaining leaves fluttered harmlessly to the ground, and I cautiously began to peer around myself once more. I took out my compass, trying to gauge what direction I'd floundered in, but the needle spun uselessly. I stuffed it back in my pocket and looked around again. It was then that I saw it, and I don't think I could have missed it if I tried. It was a large tunnel, and it stood just hundreds of feet away, where I am utterly certain nothing but trees and brush were before. The land rose up in a large hill to accommodate the entrance, which was framed with time-worn and moss-covered rounded stones. The ground leading into the tunnel was the same dirt, rock, and twig-covered path as the one I had led me here. And the inside appeared pitch black from where I stood. Now, I know now that when confronted with the truly impossible, there is little to do other than simply accept it in all its nonsensical glory. I can't say I had ever been faced with something quite like that until that particular morning in the woods. But one could argue that I had been searching for something impossible in every ruin or abandoned building I had clambered to before. Something outside the realm of explanation. Now that such a thing stood in front of me, my heart pounded and every nerve in my body felt tensed and alert. The urge to run was almost as strong as my urge to investigate, but if it had won out in the end, I wouldn't be here telling the story now. I only wish it had. Telling myself I was only going to take a quick and cursory look, I began moving closer to the tunnel entrance. Light seemed to go in there to die, giving off the impression that it was sucking the color and light from the forest itself. And I found that, if I stared too intently, I began to feel disoriented, even a little lightheaded. Partly to calm myself with an act of habit, I walked first to the trunk of a large and crooked pine tree that grew within an arm's reach of the tunnel, and pulled out one of the fabric strips I had brought along with me to use as a tree marker of sorts. I reached out, preparing to wrap it snugly around the wood, and then abruptly stopped. There, already tied around the trunk, was a marker of fabric that was nearly identical to mine. The only clear difference was age. This marker had obviously been through quite a long time of exposure to the elements. Its colors were faded, it was frayed on the ends, and parts were completely caked in dirt. Still, the resemblance was uncanny. You see, I don't use store-bought marker ribbons. I use old t-shirts that I tear into long strips. The particular markers I was using were crafted from a bright red shirt that was patterned with small yellow pineapples, one that I had picked up at a thrift store a year or so back. The strip I held in my hand was relatively immaculate compared to the one already tied, but it was clearly the exact same pattern and shirt material. Now, more than a little confused, I tied my marker anyway, faintly disturbed by the stark contrast of its vibrant color against the tattered version underneath. With a parting glance, I stepped over to the entrance of the tunnel. By now, the voices I had heard before were completely silent, and I could hear the distant clamor of the forest's usual inhabitants. The tunnel entrance was roughly a foot wider than my arm span on either side, and about a foot taller than myself at 5'10". What little light passed into it showed that it was constructed with the same mossy stones that ringed the opening, with the exception of the dirt-floored path. The air emanated from inside was colder than the forest, and carried a scent that reminded me of both the earth and a bitter copper sharpness. Now, I had not brought a flashlight, but I did have my cell phone with me, which could help out a bit. Plus, after a second look, I thought I could make out a small break in the darkness quite a ways in. I thought perhaps the tunnel led back out into the woods or had a gap in its ceiling. After a moment of hesitation, I lit up my phone's flashlight and plunged into the tunnel. I was immediately taken aback by how frigid it was. It felt like I had stepped into the heart of a winter's day, and my breath was suddenly visible in front of me. A couple of small beetles scattered from their dark corners as I illuminated them, and it only took a few minutes of walking inwards for me to run into a few dusty cobwebs. For the first 5 minutes or so, the tunnel was unremarkable. Well, unremarkable aside from being a tunnel that appeared in the middle of the woods as ominous disembodied voices talked amongst themselves. Still, it looked perfectly normal. With every step leading me closer to the light I'd seen from the entrance, my nerves began to relax ever so slightly. This changed as soon as I reached the light source. It was, as I had suspected, an opening in the ceiling of the tunnel, and I now realized the ceiling had been rising steadily, putting the opening well out of my arm's reach. A dull gray light poured in from the hole in the rock, just barely illuminating the fork in the tunnel I had come to face. And 2 paths now laid before me. Straight ahead appeared darker than even the most pitch black of nights, but to my right was a slightly curved path that I could just make out another sliver of light in. Opting for the safety of visibility, I turned and continued on toward the right. It was then that I noticed the rocks making up the wall in this part of the tunnel were larger, more like slabs than stones, and many of them were covered in carvings. Streams of what looked like letters and sentences were followed by arrows which were often clearly carved over time and time again. And try as I might to make sense of them, they appeared entirely random, sometimes pointing up, down, or even 2 pointing straight at each other. Combined with the indecipherable words, I was beginning to feel more and more on edge. Regardless, I crept forward. The soft light I had seen back at the path's beginning came into view, and I saw with a shock that it was coming from a lit lantern perched on a raised slab of stone in a crude imitation of a desk or a table. It was pushed against the wall of a wider section of the tunnel. Beside the lantern sat an incredibly old typewriter, its brass keys stained with ink and another substance that reminded me a little too much of blood. Now, using the light of the lantern, I turned around in search of any other signs of someone in the tunnel. Now, clearly, someone had been here recently, obviously as signified by the lantern's lit candle. It was while I was exploring the immediate area that I found my backpack. Even though I still had my bag securely on my shoulders, there was no denying what I saw in front of me. to the side of the stone slab, crusted in dirt and dark stains, torn in many places and visibly distressed, sat my backpack. It was the same style, the same color, albeit faded, and the same initials stitched crudely into the upper section. It even had the same broken zipper on the side. My head began to spin, and I steadied myself against the makeshift table. How could my bag be here, showing signs of advanced wear and tear, when I was still carrying it on my back? How could that trail marker outside the tunnel also match mine, despite the same inexplicable signs of aging? I glanced over to the typewriter again, and realized there were stacks of paper set to the side of it. Some were still blank, but there were a few pages covered in text that I pulled towards me. There was significant damage to them all, with the majority of the words being smeared or washed out by what appeared to be water stains. Large drops of deep crimson dotted out a vast amount of the rest, and there were some tears around the edges. I could only clearly make out the fragmented sentence at the very bottom of the last page, which read, "I see him coming now. I need to get out of here." Almost as if it was set off by my reading, a loud, deep growl began to rise up around me, echoing off the stone of the tunnel. There isn't an animal alive I could truly compare to the sound, too. It was impossibly deep, and I felt it resonate down in my bones. Turning my head to try to figure out where it came from, I first saw it. It stood in the shadow of the tunnel walls, reaching an elongated and emaciated arm in my direction. Standing far taller than me on equally stretched and slender legs, its head nearly scraped the ceiling. Its cracked, leathery skin was an ashen gray that seemed to be pulled excruciatingly taut around its stretched-out form. Its hand ended in 5 thin, curved appendages that each sprouted twisted, jagged nails, and its saucer-like eyes were alarmingly pale and pierced through the dark like flames. I began to run as soon as it unhinged its wide jaw, letting out an anguished and aggravated scream unlike anything I've ever heard a creature on this planet make. I ran blindly, dropping my phone and backpack behind me as I sped back the way I'd come before, all the while painfully aware that it was lurching just behind me. Its growls and shrieks of protest grew in an angry frenzy as I whipped back around to where the opening to the tunnel ceiling should have been. Except instead of a hole in the tunnel, I found myself outside of the tunnel altogether. Even more curious was the fact that I was up to my knees in snow, and more flakes were falling down with aggressive speed. I turned my head and saw the tree that I recognized from the entrance to the tunnel, which most certainly should not have been there. Yet, there were fabric markers tied to its snow-blistered trunk. In fact, when I narrowed my eyes, I could just barely make out what seemed like a third identical marker wrapped over the others. A roar from inside the tunnel snapped me back into action. There was no way I could escape through such deeply packed snow. So, my only option was to turn back into the tunnel and hope I could find another path. Corridors seemed to appear at random now, and I followed them as they formed, all the while trying to distract myself from one of the other troubling things I'd noticed about the creature hunting me down. It had been wearing torn scraps of my clothing. I must have been running for days, managing to sleep in short bursts against the tunnel floor, always awoken by inhuman cries. And sometimes I would find myself at the tunnel entrance again, regardless of what turns I chose, and it was always a different scene to behold. There was a young sapling holding the markers at the entrance in the middle of a summer heatwave. There was a blackened, ash-covered forest that reeked of gasoline, and there was a barren land of cracked clay and skeletal trees. one holding onto charred remains of once red strips of t-shirt. Each time, the unknown of those realities sent me back into the tunnels, hoping against hope that I would find myself back at the entrance resembling the one I had originally walked through. The only time I did, I was horrified to see myself standing in front of it, carefully tying a red marker to the tunnel's pine tree guardian. I ran. Dehydrated and starving, a time came where I realized that I could no longer hear any traces of the creature hunting me. My pace slowed to a stumble, and I rounded another of the endless corners of the tunnel to find myself back in the wide area with the typewriter and stone slab. My dropped phone and backpack were sprawled on the ground nearby, and I walked over to collect both of them, testing to see if the phone still had any charge. Of course, I found that it was completely dead, and furthermore, that it was thickly crusted in corrosion that could not be explained by my relatively short absence. My backpack strap crumbled under my grip as if it had been left years ago, and the water inside had long since dried up. Defeated, I headed over to the typewriter. The only papers beside it now were completely blank, and without understanding exactly why, I loaded them in and began typing what you're reading now, if anyone is reading this now. Growls and wails keep emanating from the ever-changing labyrinth around me, and more than once I've seen bobs of light in the distance that resembled a phone flashlight. Sometimes they get closer, but often they turn away down some unseen hallway. My nose randomly started bleeding a moment ago. My head is killing me. It's been too long without water, although I did eat some snow when I last encountered it at an entrance. I just wish I understood what was happening here. I wish I knew where I was or when I was, or how long I've been in here. And just now, one of the shrieks got closer, louder than it has been in a while. I hear footsteps. I think I see him coming now. I need to get out of here.